It's always a pleasure to, on behalf of the Ashank Desai Center for Leadership and Organizational Development, to welcome researchers to talk about their work on leadership. And today we have the rare, in fact, in the last so many talks that we have done, this is going to be our first talk that is being presented by authors in India and about leadership lessons in India. So we are very, very fortunate and very, very excited about this. As many of you possibly know, that our interest is in promoting evidence-based research, good research on this whole topic of leadership. And therefore, the book Leadership for Disaster Resilience, Lessons from India, caught our attention, and we started reading it, and we felt that only we should not be the ones reading it. Most of you should also be hearing about it, and we should possibly be creating more waves and more interesting research in this topic. And I think unfortunately, in the current, what happened last week with the sad accident at Air India, which is basically a disaster. Now, a disaster can happen. That is something that possibly one cannot control, and it is inevitable. But the leader's response to it can then help the community to deal with it, the people who are part of the disaster to deal with it, and possibly also for us to learn lessons as to how to not, how to respond to it better and better as we go along. And I think, therefore, the book, when we started the conversation on having this particular talk, I was thinking, abhi to bahut din se there hasn't been a disaster, and therefore maybe it won't be timely, but unfortunately, it has become timely. So sometimes, what we think about comes to, it's just not fair. But anyway, I'm really happy to have Professors Jaquleen, Zubin Mulla, and Suchita here today to talk about their insights from the book that they have published. And it is my real pleasure to introduce, everyone. Each of you in the next few minutes, and then I'm going to leave the floor open. I don't want to take time, the little time that we have from you. Professor Jaquleen is a professor and dean at the Jamshedji Tata School of Disaster Studies at the TISS. She has a master's in social work, and she's followed by an MPhil and PhD in psychiatric social work from the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences, NIMHANS in India. She's actively engaged in long-term research, field action of the psychosocial domain in several disasters, starting with the 2004 tsunami in Chennai and other parts of India, and to that of Nepal earthquake and the COVID pandemic. And I think there is nobody better qualified than Professor Jaquleen to speak about this work. Suchita holds a master's in climate science and policy from Terry School of Advanced Studies. Her specialization involves vulnerability to disasters and climate change, community-based adaptation, water resource management, and she has almost 10 years of experience in integrating climate science expertise into development research and practice. She also is currently the National Project Coordinator at Wetlands International South Asia. So welcome, Suchita, and we really value the kind of experience that you bring into this work. Professor Zubin Mulla, who definitely needs no introduction for many of you, is a professor at the School of Management and Labor Studies at TIS, Mumbai. He has a degree in mechanical engineering, followed by a postgraduate diploma in business management and a PhD in XLRI, Jamshedpur. And prior to joining academics in 2005, he also worked in engineering design and management consulting. He has wide research interests and experience of the industry, and therefore again he merges and brings something that is very valuable both to research and practice. So all three of you couldn't have done, we couldn't have found better work than this, and a better team than this to talk about this particular topic. So over to you, and welcome again, and thank you for doing this for us.
Thank you, Niharika. First of all, thanks to the Ashrank Desai Center for Leadership and Organizational Development, Niharika and her team, for giving us this opportunity to talk about our book and our research. We'll start with this presentation while Suchita is pulling up the presentation. We've divided the presentation into three parts between the three of us. I would be presenting the context of the research and the book, explain the two key concepts that we engaged with, leadership and disaster resilience, and the key contributions of the book in brief. Then Suchita would take over from me to talk about the conceptual framework and methodology of the work that we did. And Zubin would present a sample of our analysis and the framework emerging from the study to kind of give you a feel of the book. So to start with, I will setting the context, as Niharika said, the Air India accident recently and many other disasters, the increasing frequency and unprecedented intensity and consequences of disasters sets the context for this research as well as the book. Suchita, if you could go to the next slide here. The need for comprehensive societal change was recognized and honored in 2015 with three major breakthroughs in the policy arena, namely the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, all of them in 2015. These global policy commitments led to the recognition of collaborative, integrated, and synergistic action between actors across sectors. Thus, the emphasis on resilience and leadership gained prominence as actors steering societal change, and this set the context for the specific focus on. So this, with these policy frameworks, the need for collaborative, integrated, and synergistic action between actors across sectors kind of became evident. And this kind of gave the impetus for looking at resilience and leadership as drivers of societal change. And this set the context for the study of leadership for disaster resilience. The study happened in 2017, and we did the writing in 2019, 20, 21. And as we all know, this was the period, the COVID period from 20 onwards, which further emphasized the need for a study of leadership and resilience. Though there has been a recognition since 2015, a policy commitment, a global commitment for interconnectedness and integrated approach and action, sadly, it remains limited to the formal institutions and policy arena. It does not take into consideration the multitude of other actors, institutions, network processes, macro level factors, including leadership that shape resilience. Building initiatives have not been explored, and hence we decided to go ahead with this. So now I move on to the next aspect of looking at the two core concepts that we have used in our work, which would be essential in kind of understanding. One is disaster resilience, and the other is leadership. The first one being disaster resilience. Usually, if you look up definitions of disaster resilience, you will see this as the internal conditions, internal intrinsic capacities, ability, potential of the entity of interest, often the individuals. That's why the figure kind of shows an individual, often centered around the individual, for change, adjustment, adaptation, anticipate, prepare, respond, and recover in the context of disasters. The entity of interest often is the individual, but it could be households, it could be economies, ecologies, nations, regions, it could be infrastructure, any of this. It could be any of this kind of resilience, but it often, the literature is largely around the entity of interest, which is the individual. It could be reactive versus futuristic, in the sense reactive where it is being spoken about in the context post a disaster, post an adversity. For example, the Air India accident, we talk about the resilience of the institutional setup, of the response system, or of the families. Or it could be futuristic, where we kind of, it's not a post adversity or a post event, but it is about risks and uncertainties. The commonly, though a lot of words like to leap, shrink, avoid, retreat, cancel, return, desist, adapt, rigidity, ductility, all these words you would find in these definitions, but then the core essence or the common essence are three, basically: bounce back. So then people bounce back to what you were before the disaster. People were not very happy with the back part of it, so then it kind of gave a negative connotation. So they've used connotations like bounce better, bounce forward. The second core essence of it is post-adversity, positive growth. So it's not about just going back to where you were, but you kind of flourish from there. You kind of draw learnings from the adversity and you grow, and then you kind of flourish after that. And the acceptability of the improved state. That's the third core essence. Very often the bounce back or the bounce back better is kind of very popular and very heavily emphasized upon. But the other two of the focus has not been much on the post-adversity, positive growth, and acceptability of the improved state. In spite of that, it has been the concept has been heavily critiqued for this very narrow focus on bouncing back. And it has also been critiqued for being very individualistic, denying vulnerability, social and environmental justice, and being co-opted the appropriation, the neoliberal appropriation of systemic and social structural transformative change. So the critique, primarily, to put it in simple words, the critique of the current resilience paradigm is about it becoming a normative concept focused on the property of the entity that would enable it to avoid, resist, respond, adapt, and recover from immediate disasters, rather than that of the system that contributes to differential vulnerability and disaster risks. So instead of focusing on systemic and social structural change, we've been focusing too much on the entity that has been kind of affected by the disaster. So this kind of leaves us with two options. Either we focus on developing capacities to maintain or adapt system functions during crisis and uncertainty, or we take up an option of challenging the status quo and bringing about radical, non-linear systemic and structural changes in complex socio-ecological systems. So do we get to addressing the root causes, or do we just do patch up, build capacities, train, do drills? So that's the kind of question that resilience is faced with. When we say resilience, which option do we go with? We went with the second option in operationalizing the concept of resilience for the study. And we drew from, Suchita, the next slide, we drew from the alternative articulations of disaster resilience that emphasize on interdependence, collective efforts. It conceptualizes resilience as organic in nature. And it also kind of visualizes resilience to be nurtured, and it flourishes in a society that is aligned with justice, dignity, requiring transformation in our activities. And it will not be, it is not just about power and the powerful, but it will be about each one of us. It's about what we do in our everyday lives. All of it matters, and it is just not people who are sitting in the helm of affairs. Suchita, the next slide. So drawing from this alternative conception, a big chunk of literature, we've operationalized disaster resilience as follows. Disaster resilience is the ability of a system, community, or society encountering disaster risk to resist, absorb, accommodate, adapt to recover, and transform from the effects of disaster by addressing the root causes of a disaster through systemic and social structural changes from within the value framework of social and environmental justice. So this is how we've kind of defined. The mainstream definitions are very much given in the text. Suchita, the next. In the last definition, I wanted to focus on the root changes in the root causes of disasters and the value grounding in social and environmental justice. Similarly, leadership, which is a very, I'm sure for the audience as well as for the organizing team, leadership must be a very familiar concept, so I'm going to run through it. We've drawn from literature on leadership that differentiate itself from leaders, that has enabled us to kind of go beyond the individual characteristics and include the immediate context, situation, structures, and macro processes. The literature on leadership beyond the individual kind of helps us go beyond the individual corporate dyads and look at shared or collective leadership, network leadership, complexity, and team leaderships. The literature on leadership beyond organizational boundaries, like that of the multi-team system, kind of helped us go beyond the individual corporate dyad, beyond the organization. So till now, it was all about leadership in organization, and now it was kind of beyond organizations. So we kind of expanded our operationalization of our leadership definition by drawing from these. And the last set of literature, which is the organizations demonstrating leadership within a network of organizations, like the multi-system inter-organizational leadership, we were kind of able to focus on leadership of organizations rather than leadership in organizations. So by pulling all this literature, the rich source of literature that kind of is there out there on leadership, we're able to define leadership or operationalize leadership as follows. Leadership is defined as the process by which individuals, groups, organizations, or institutions use their expertise and resources to evolve, identify, and implement socially and environmentally just solutions to meet the social and material needs of the community or society by engaging the expertise, effort, and willing cooperation of other individuals, groups, networks, organizations, or institutions within and outside their organizational boundaries. So a last set of, so this helped us in kind of conceptualizing, operationalizing the leadership. When we kind of engage with the leadership, what would that mean to us? But the literature on leadership in extreme contexts of crisis, emergency, and disasters helped us kind of decide on which aspects of disasters we would, or which disasters that we would kind of focus upon. So this literature on leadership in extreme contexts basically draws from emergency management, crisis management, and disaster management. The leadership literature in extreme context, however, is dominated by the study of emergency management. There's a lot of work that has happened on emergency management, where there have been studies on trauma organizations, like that of hospital emergency rooms or ambulance emergency rooms, critical action organizations, and high reliability organizations like the fire, search and rescue organization, disaster response teams, military combat units, disease control organizations, nuclear power plant safety operations team. So most of the leadership studies have focused on these kinds of have been located in emergency context, and have focused on the emergency situation. That there is always an urgency in this particular. But the literature has, though disaster management itself kind of emerges from the crisis management, the literature has kind of evolved, and they though differentiate between disasters, crises, emergencies, catastrophes. There is literature that differentiate, but there is also a holistic frame, which I'm kind of bringing here, which kind of conceives all of them under the larger crisis management umbrella, where we kind of look at two kinds of crises: the emergency management which is the routine crisis, and that of disasters and catastrophes or extreme events, which are non-routine crises. So they kind of fit within the larger crisis management domain. But the characteristics of these the two distinctions that we have made between emergency management and that of disasters and catastrophe are also characterized by very unique dimensions that are kind of captured in the two columns. So one thing that you will see, there is certainty in emergency management, there is high probability in emergency management, and there's usually a single organization involvement, and there is a response time that is available. You know that you're going to receive at least 4 or 5 calls of fire per day, and you're prepared for it. So that's the kind of but in a disaster and catastrophe context, this is a lot of uncertainty. You don't know when it is going to strike, whether it will be today or 10 years later. It could be a high probability hazards like floods in Bihar, which you expect every year, or floods in Mumbai, which you kind of expect and prepare for every year. And there are multiple organizations involved, and there is inconceivability. You're not very sure. In an emergency room or in an ambulance room, you're very sure about what you're wanting to do, but here you're not. So that's the kind of broad distinctions that we are making. But both of them have a urgency urgency element to it, where it's the emergency phase when we are largely talking about the emergency phase. But disasters have other phases other than this emergency phase, which gets covered under the non-routine crisis leadership literature. So the study of so the other phases of disasters, which is the mitigation, long-term response, and recovery phase, is something that we wanted to focus on because there was no focus on these phases. And the study of these phases is characterized by certain key elements, which is high stakes, uncertainty, and diminished sense of urgency. And this fits very well for this whole social and social structural transformative work that we expect leaders to kind of engage in. So it was not about in the middle of an emergency, what will a leader do? But it is more about when there is no urgency, what will a leader do to be able to prevent life loss and destruction? And so how would someone work on mitigation and long-term recovery? So Suchita, next slide. So situating explain the two concepts that we are kind of dealing with. Now, broadly, I'll quickly run through the contributions of the book to give you the larger picture and link the presentations that follow. So substantively, this is not my words. This is Jaideep Prabhu, University of Cambridge. His foreword kind of illustrates these. It says, substantively, the book attempts to bring the essence of transformative change grounded in values of social and environmental justice back into the discourse on leadership for disaster resilience. And it focuses on a wide range of factors from local to national level, including individuals, public sector, civil society, and institutions. Methodologically, striking feature of the book is its multi-case study approach, which Suchita would elaborate further. And conceptually, the interdisciplinary blend of perspectives like the management, public administration, social and political science, and disaster studies is one of the key contributions of the book. The key takeaways that emerge from this are the book illustrates the institutional embeddedness of leaders and leadership and it kind of in 4 different institutional contexts, it kind of does that. It illustrates the key challenges of disaster resilience leadership. It brings out the specific strengths and challenges encountered by leaders across the spheres at various levels, which Zubin then brings together to kind of come up with the framework that emerges from the study. And the shift from procedural aspects of justice to realization-focused approaches to structural inequality and injustice, which is nothing but rather than focusing on giving too much of an emphasis on institutional policies, guidelines, rules and codes, leaders need to focus on arriving at the next best alternative to be able to address the inequities and injustices that they encounter in their everyday work. So with this, I kind of hand over to Suchita to kind of detail the method. So this was the conceptualization. She would take on from the conceptualization and the methodology part.
Thank you, Jaqueline.
Thank you, Professor Jackie. Now I'll take you through the conceptual framework that we have used for the book. And as Professor Jacqueline already mentioned, that we did not align to one particular definition for disaster resilience leadership. Rather, we had taken the key elements or the key dimensions of each one of the definitions and had come up with the definition that Professor Jacqueline just shared. And for the conceptual framework, we have acknowledged the fact that resilience leadership for disaster, it's needed and it's imperative to finding the sustainable solutions for the challenges that are faced by the global environmental crisis. Now, disaster risk and the initiatives for disaster resilience leadership, they are well positioned within the modernization, risk society, liberalization, and globalization. These are the macro processes within which these two are based. And also, these processes have an impact on the initiatives and the actions of the actors, especially when they are juxtaposed with the ethical dilemma that a leader faces while managing disaster. We have also understood that any action in silo will not help in achieving the resilience. So, for that, we need a collective approach wherein the formal and the informal actors have to work together. So it includes all the individuals, the government led, the NGO, the collectives, and the established institutions have to work together towards a shared vision. And these visions are to be intertwined with the public good, integrated planning, social justice, and others. And when they all work together, the resulting systemic socio-structural transformations are the indication that the solutions towards the challenges that are faced due to global environmental crisis are met. Now, what we had done for as we know that India is actually prone to multiple disasters, we had to come up with the exhaustive set of case studies. And to achieve that, what we did is first we assess the vulnerability of the states. That is basically profiling, establishing a risk profile of the states. Once that is done, then we use the K means clustering to divide the states into two groups. One, which are very vulnerable, highly vulnerable, including the socioeconomic vulnerability, and those which are very low vulnerable. Then, from these 18 sets, we took final representative sample of these 18 states, and that represents the various ecoregions of the country. So it could be hot, humid, arid region, semi-arid region, your islands, your cold deserts, etc. Now, from these 18 states, we had an illustrative set of 76 initiatives. And how we covered it? Using the various secondary material, the various reports, journal articles, and we also know there are a lot of knowledge sharing platform wherein the best practices or the good practices are shared. What we realized is that maximum initiatives, the majority of the initiatives, were from the NGOs or the CSOs, which was followed by the government-led initiatives, and then individuals, and 13% were from the institutions. And about the nature of intervention. So all these hilly areas, the northern state, are basically prone to landslides, and which is why the intervention were mostly on revival of livelihoods, natural resource rejuvenation, building the capacities of people towards building disaster resilience and adaptive capacities, and they were largely taken up by the CSOs and public sector actors. Going ahead, for the dry lands, mostly the Maharashtra and Gujarat belt, which face droughts every alternate year or having at least drought-like situations. So water scarcity was the major issue. And there the actors, which are the communities, the NGOs, the government-led interventions, were majorly focusing on the water management issues. So that is through either resource conservation, reviving the age-old practices for water management, or water harvesting. Now your Gangetic and Brahmaputra and Gangetic floodplains are prone to floods, and here the interventions were for livelihood generation, having early warning system put in place, and again done by majority interventions were by communities. then by civil society organization, and also by the private sector. And finally, for the cyclone prone regions, the interventions focused on post disaster rescue relief. And again, they were done by communities, NGOs, and the public sector actors. Now, for the case studies to come up for this book, come up with the final 19 case studies out of 76, what we had done is we had an overarching principle or the criteria, wherein we focused only on non-event centric disaster resilience leadership practices. So they have some kind of non-urgency. They also look forward to a long term sustainable impact and also have some kind of historical issues or historical risk that the region was facing. And the sub criterion were comprehensive and uniqueness of the case study, whether the outcomes were long term or short lived. They need to address the systemic and socio-structural root cause and also bring about some kind of transformative change. And not only that, they need to have an embodiment of the value of public good. What we had also included certain unique cases or pioneering cases which fulfill all these five criterion for cross case comparisons. What was excluded was any ongoing initiative where we did not find any recorded or documented impacts, or anywhere where we could not find the primary key stakeholder to interview or to ask more questions or to corroborate the information that we had got from the secondary literature. And then finally, of these 19 cases, we grouped them into four clusters. So one were individuals in informal positions who are pioneers in their respective areas, in their own jurisdiction, the areas they live, and their approach was innovative towards building the disaster resilience. Then was public sector actor, which is led by any kind of public institutions, and their initiatives later on were mainstreamed in a larger policy framework. It could be at the state level, it could be at the national level. For the civil society, we had any associations, the NGOs, CSOs, or the movement who, for the building resilience, are also addressing the representation and claims making. And finally, we had the special institutions. So this could be scientific, academic, private, formal institutions who are also bringing in some kind of institutional change. And these are the illustrative list of the case studies. The individuals we'll discuss in the next slides. However, for the public sector, there were certain initiatives that were like for the fisheries revival in Jharkhand. It was taken up by the fisheries department. In Sabujan case, it was riverbed rejuvenation or just kind of controlling the erosion that was happening because of a river in the Nadia district. Jalyuk Shivar Abhiyan is taken up by a Pune divisional commissioner who was trying to bring up a community-based, a participatory approach towards dealing with drought. Malin landslide is a case wherein again a Pune-based district administration helped in rehabilitation of those affected by the landslide. And Hivre Bazaar is an example as to how an elected representative of Hivre Bazaar, the panchayat leader, helped in again community-based water resources management. In institutions, we had for academic Tata Institute of Social Sciences and its evolution over the years and how they had come up with or developed a proper discipline on disaster. Tata Group has been known for their actions and interventions on the regions that are disaster struck. So, how they have evolved and institutionalized disaster resilience building within their CSR, within their various networks. Gujarat State Disaster Management Authority is an example which set up the tone for a national level regulatory framework on disaster management. IMD, how the scientific and technological innovation has led to improvement in early warning systems in the country. And finally, for the civil society, we had women-centered leadership, which is for Anandi and Seva. Then we have ethnic identity and traditions and norms are intertwined in any disaster-related interventions that Young Mizo Association was implementing. And finally, a collective identity and leadership for the people who were displaced due to riverbed erosion in Bihar. So we'll go ahead with the individual case study by Professor Zubin. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Suchita. So I'll be covering two things. I'll be talking about the individual case studies and their analysis, and we'll evolve a framework for individual leadership in disaster resilience. And then we'll put together the learning from all these 17 cases in terms of a comprehensive model of disaster resilience leadership. And after that, we'll open it up to questions. So in the case of individual case studies, we looked at the 5 cases of Rajendra Singh, Lakshman Singh, Balbir Singh, Chewang Norfel, and Vilas Rao Salunke. Our approach to these was to use a qualitative case study approach, and we used existing leadership theories to understand 3 things. One is, how did leadership emerge in these people? That means, how did they manage to build the initial rapport and relationship with their audience? Second is, what did they actually do in order to further their cause? And finally, we evaluate the outcomes that they have achieved. So finally, we will put together all that we say in terms of a framework which comprises of these 3 things: leadership emergence, leadership practices, and leadership outcomes. Next slide. So when we look at leadership emergence, we started by using the framework given by Max Weber, where he talks about the different kinds of authority. And we found that most of these individuals had some form of charismatic authority. That means the extent of their influence went beyond whatever formal position they held. Rajendra Singh is an example of pure charismatic authority, whereas Lakshman Singh, being from a upper class landlord community, has a mix of charismatic and traditional authority. Balbir Singh, again, being part of the religious tradition, has a mix of charismatic and traditional authority. Chewang Norfel, being a civil engineer working in the government, had a mix of charismatic and rational authority. And Vilas Rao Salunke, again, had only charismatic authority. So the charismatic authority is something that is common in all of them. When we look at what Weber talks about in terms of the elements of charisma, we find all the elements of charisma, the 5 elements of charisma in the case of these individuals. So for example, if we were to look at the case of Rajendra Singh, we find that this environment within which he functioned was affected by drought and illiteracy. He came up as an extraordinary individual, a medical doctor, a good orator, influenced by Gandhi, who believed in simple living. He gave some innovative ideas as a solution of the crisis. One was to revive the traditional practice of johads, which is concave earthen dams. And as a result of that, he had people who were attracted to him. He ended up having some kind of success where there was, after 18 months, he was able to make sure that the place had enough water. And as a result of that, he ended up having charismatic authority over people. Next slide. We also find some relevance of the social identity theory given by Van Nippenburg, where they talk about leader prototypicality. We find that each one of these individuals had kind of established their prototypicality. What prototypicality means is that the leader represents the ideal of a group member. So group members see the leader as someone who is an ideal. We see that in each one cases. In case of Balbir Singh, for example, he belonged to the community, and he was seen as an ideal by virtue of being the head of the spiritual organization. In addition to being prototypical amongst the group of people that they seek to lead, the leaders also engaged in some kind of self-sacrificing behavior. This again enhances what is seen as heroism by people, because when the audience sees the leader engaging in self-sacrificing behavior, they see the leader as someone who's willing to give up their selfish interests for the sake of the group. So we see again in the case of Balbir Singh, where the Kali Bain, the river which was the target of his intervention, was extremely polluted. And he jumped into the dirty river and started cleaning it himself. That, of course, became an impetus for others to follow him, and then led to the movement taking on traction. And we see that in the case of each of these people. In case of Rajendra Singh, he worked shoulder to shoulder along with people to construct the johads. In case of Lakshman Singh, he became a role model by giving up dowry. In case of Vilas Rao Salunke, again, he left the comforts of the city to come and settle in the village. And all this enhanced the impression in the mind of the audience as to the leader's credibility and the leader's motives, which were for the benefit of the group. Next slide. Once having established this, the leaders engaged in 2 kinds of practices. One is building relationships for strategic and operational networking. So each of these leaders, we find, they had 2 kinds of networks. The first network was what we call a strategic network, in which case the leader reaches out to people who have resources in order to further the goals of the group. And the second is operational networking, which enables the leaders to mobilize people at the ground level in the pursuit of the mission. So if we look at the case of Lakshman Singh, his strategic network involved other landlords. Being a landlord himself, he was able to reach out to other landlords, build the rapport with them, build credibility, gain their support in order to further his mission. And he also reached out to educated and unemployed villagers to make sure that the mobilization for his project was successful. Next slide. Now, when we need to get the support of people and mobilize them in the pursuit of a common goal, it helps to have a narrative. In each of these cases, we find that there was a very strong narrative which actually harnessed the emotions of the people. And this narrative has essentially 4 elements. One was it had some kind of a cultural, religious resonance. Second is it talked about the status quo, why it was unacceptable. It talked about an ideal position, and it was a call to action. So we find in each of these individuals, there was some kind of a culturally rooted narrative which built on these 3 things and mobilized people. Next slide. Now we are looking at how do we evaluate the outcomes of these leaders. So one template we use is the charisma routinization template given by Trice and Bayer, which also builds on the work of Max Weber. To what extent were administrative structures put in place? To what extent did the followers have rites and rituals which connected them to the major mission? To what extent were there written or oral traditions which continued to share the work of the leader? To what extent were successors appointed? And to what extent did the work continue? Now here we find some mixed results. In the case of Rajendra Singh, we find that charisma routinization was relatively successful. Not only was there an elaborate organization structure, there were rites and rituals. That is, anybody who's part of that organization will volunteer, wear khadi, not partake alcohol. There is detailed written and oral traditions in terms of publications on how river rejuvenation should happen. The life of Rajendra Singh, his talks, etc., are preserved and disseminated amongst the followers. His son is anointed as the successor for this movement. And the work continues in full steam, rejuvenation of rivers, and they've also diversified into a couple of other areas. In case of Chewang Norfel, there was no charisma routinization, which is why after his efforts, the movement kind of ended. In case of Lakshman Singh, again, we find some kind of ineffective charisma routinization, which is why the movement is currently in decline. Next slide. If we were to look at the effectiveness of the organization per se, we evaluated that based on these 5 parameters. To what extent has the public recognized it, and to what extent have they got legitimacy, either through government policies, etc.? To what extent are the members engaged in the activities that the founders started off? To what extent are more leaders being developed in the organization? To what extent is the organization responding to the emerging needs of the community? And finally, to what extent is the organization inclusive and catering to diverse audiences such as different caste and gender and so on? Here we find, if you look at the case of Balbir Singh, we find that there has been immense public recognition in terms of his being part of the Pollution Control Board, being an invited international speaker. There is high member involvement. There is a lot of ongoing development of young leaders who are being groomed to take on the mantle. The organization is expanded from earlier river cleaning and road building into things like education and other development activities. And we find that the movement in terms of caste and gender is inclusive, but mainly confined to the Sikh community. Next slide. When we put all this together, we find that the answers to our 3 questions, that is, how does leadership emerge, what leadership practices are there, and what kind of leadership outcomes are there, can be put together in this model, which we've put in the book. So in terms of leadership emergence, we find a mix of charismatic and some other, either traditional or rational authority. We find that all the 5 elements of charisma are present in the case of the leaders, which enabled them to attract attention of the audience. We find elements of heroism in terms of self-sacrificing behavior. In terms of leadership practices, we find relationship building at 2 levels, strategic and operational. We find that there is a cultural religious narrative which talks about the status quo and why it needs to be changed. we find that there is a strategy which is the technical solution to the crisis. Now here it is either involve reviving a traditional practice as in the case of Rajendra Singh, or transplanting a practice from one place to another as in the case of Lakshman, or developing an indigenous solution as in the case of Chewang. And there would be, in terms of the structure or the crucible within which the event, the change happens, we find that there are two alternatives. Either you align with an existing organization, as in the case of Rajendra, where he aligned with Tarun Bharat Sangh, or create a new organization, as in the case of Vilas Rao, where he created the Pani Panchayat. And finally, we have the leadership outcomes, which we have spoken about. Now, coming to the integration of all the cases, not just the individual cases, but all the cases together in the form of a framework. Next slide. We look at two kinds of actors. The first is non-formal actors, and the second is formal actors. Now, within the non-formal actors, we have individuals like the ones we have spoken about, Rajendra Singh, Lakshman Singh, and others. Then we have collectives of individuals, like we have Vistapit Mukti Vahini in Bihar, or the Young Mizo Association. Then we have NGOs, such as Anandi in Gujarat, and Seva and Watershed Organization Trust. We found that there is a lot of give and take between the NGOs and the collectives of organizations, where, let us say, Anandi working with the Devgad Mahila Sangathan, or the Watershed Organization Trust working with the village watershed communities. Now, when we put these all together, this forms the cluster of the non-formal organization. We find that most of these initiatives are bottom-up. The strength of these initiatives is that they are participatory and context-specific. They build on the community. Suchita, next, yeah. And they are context-specific. That means they are tailor-made to the needs of the group and the community. One of the challenges in these initiatives, of course, is that they are not really taken up quickly in terms of policy making. So while they are tailored to the unique needs of the community, unfortunately, they are not taken up well by the government or policy initiatives. Next. When it comes to formal actors, we have established institutions like the Tata Group, you have IMD, you have political representatives like Anand Rao Patil, and you have career bureaucrats like the Pune Divisional Commissioner and the Special Secretary at Sikkim, whose cases we have studied. Put together, this entire group consists of the formal actors. Most of these initiatives are top-down initiatives, and some of the strengths of these initiatives is that they quickly translate into policies. However, the challenge with some of these initiatives is that they are usually not custom-made or tailor-made. We find that most of these initiatives are either existing initiatives which are put onto policies and with very little or no modification at all, as a result of which they may not be customized or may not meet the needs of the group. Next slide. But what we see is there is a kind of a diffusion of innovation. So for example, if you look at the Ralegaon Siddhi to the Adarsh Gaon Yojana, where an initiative which started in the non-formal sector actually then diffuses and becomes part of the government establishment and then translates into the policy. So this is the entire model. What we did was we looked at the state of Maharashtra, and we looked at the state of Maharashtra timeline from 1973 all the way to 2013, a span of 50 years. And we looked at all the initiatives that have happened in the state of Maharashtra with respect to drought management. And we tried to illustrate our framework using the case of the Maharashtra drought management. Next slide. So this is our framework, which we spoke about, the non-formal organizations on the left-hand side, the formal on the right-hand side, strengths and limitations of each one, and the diffusion happening between them. So in the case of Maharashtra specifically, if you were to look at the community, it would be the villages like Ralegaon Siddhi or Hivre Bazar, and the farmers and the local water association, which are the target of our intervention. Then if we look at the non-formal organization, you would have things like the Water Organization Trust, Father Barker's NGO Coalition, the Pani Panchayat, the Anna Hazare's movement, and Vilas Rao Salunke's movement, which would all be the non-formal initiatives taken up in Maharashtra drought prevention. In terms of the formal initiatives, you have the state government of Maharashtra, NABARD, the Chief Minister's initiative, V.S. Page's initiative, who pioneered the Employment Guarantee Scheme in Maharashtra, the Divisional Commissioner of Pune, who initiated the Jal Yukt Gaon Abhiyan. Now, when we look at how this worked, you see that Anna Hazare's movement and Vilasrao Salunke's movement of Pani Panchayat were extremely context specific. They used the support of the people for Shramdan, and their initiatives were those which were tailor made to meet the needs of the people. However, if you look at the case of the formal initiatives such as COWDEP, these were relatively inflexible, and they had very little community participation. Similarly, when it comes to challenges, even though Pani Panchayat was extremely successful, it took time and struggled in order to be recognized by the state, in order to be developed as a state policy. On the other hand, if you see the government initiatives like EGS, it was very quickly employment guarantee scheme scaled into the national Manrega policy. Now, some of the policies that have really helped Maharashtra, are the Adarsh Gaon Yojana, Jal Yug Shivar Yojana, National Manrega, and the National Common Guidelines for Watershed Development. If you look at the diffusion of innovation that has happened between the non-formal actors and the formal institution, you find that the participative model from Ralegaon Siddhi, which was then adopted by the government of Maharashtra, and the methods from the NGO-led Indo-German Watershed Development Program, these are good examples of diffusion of innovation from the informal sector to the formal sector. So what we have seen here is interplay between the grassroots initiatives as well as the formal structures. Now, both have strengths and challenges. What we have shared today is part of a larger initiative where we've listened, observed, and tried to learn from diverse actors. We've brought these initiatives together in our book. Suchita, next slide. And we see this as the beginning of a conversation. We look forward to your insights, critiques, and conversations.
Thank you. This was a fair bit of information presented in less than 45 minutes. That's commendable. So can we ask a couple of, and we'll wait for the audience to ask questions, but I had two questions that I thought we could start off with. One of them is, the one, let's say, the examples that you have picked up are individuals taking the responsibility, and then it becomes their life mission. But when you have a bureaucrat, when you have like a government body where the person is not going to be there forever, they will move and they will do that. And as a result, how does the resilience gets built in is a question that I had. So that was one. And maybe I'll just wait for you to answer that and then ask you the next one.
Yeah, I think Suchita could talk about that in terms of the Anna Rao Patil movement, which later on, started off with a political representative starting something, but then built into something bigger.
Yeah, so in case of the elective representative of Hivre Bazaar, that one example wherein this elective representative started off with the model village, and all he had to do is come up with kind of some 5 principles so as to allow the community to come together to conserve water, because it was a drought prone region and everybody needed to work together to save water, to conserve water, and practice some agriculture practices that do not require a lot of bore wells digging and all that. And later, when it was the government of Maharashtra realized that this is one practice that can be later on taken up at the Maharashtra scale, at the state level intervention, the state then took it up, mainstreamed it in their state policy, and came up with a yojana, a scheme, wherein the bore well digging or any water intensive crop, if you are growing, then there are certain principles that were in place for all these water stressed districts that they are not supposed to do. They are supposed to implement these 5 principles so as to conserve water. So that is one example wherein if it is uptake or if it is kind of mainstreamed at the state level policy, the resilience can be built.
Again, thank you, Suchita. And this is not an argument, but I'm just thinking aloud here. So let us say we want to be disaster resilient for for the fact that there is, you picked some interesting examples of water and so on and so forth. But the fact is that there is a possibility that there can be a super cyclone like in Orissa, right? And obviously, it doesn't happen every year. It happens in 10 years or 12 years or whatever it is. And you can't be prepared for it after it happens. You've got to have a level of preparation that is much more than. So how does, and the fact is that the bureaucrats don't have typically their life, their attention span is maybe for 2 to 3 years, and that is something that, how does one really work on that? Jaqueline, you have a.
Yeah. So, to add on to Suchita's point, see the best place where sustenance of your initiative could be established is within the formal institutions. The large scalability part of it, the sustainability, and how do they do it? The SOPs, their guidelines, the programs, the special programs that they kind of put, and their ability to do that. Their problem, so their strength is primarily with regard to this mainstreaming, scalability, sustainability of it. But do they get the concept right? Is the innovation a real innovation, or is it just a transition? It's just a what is a governance kind of administrative innovation. So that is well done by NGOs and communities. Because their interventions are a lot more contextual. Someone is kind of putting their life into it. And that's why we're saying if these two groups come together, if these innovations could go from here, and if the formal actors could use their strength to be able to mainstream it, to be able to ensure. And when it is poorly done, you will need every 5 years, you will need a different program when it is not really tuned to the contextual realities of it.
Okay.
So that's the formal actors, that's their strength. They can kind of come up with sustainable interventions. However, when well designed, how much extent is this particular person drawing from the experiences of communities and local organizations that have worked on?
Very interesting. So basically, it can't be one or the other. They have to work together in that. So there are two questions from the audience. There is one question where they are saying, what factors, and this is from Anuj Goel, what factors have driven and how has the diffusion of innovation taken place from non-formal to formal structures? That's one question there.
One point my colleagues could kind of add on to it. So the need for, when there is a crisis kind of a situation, you come up with certain innovations, and the uptake for it kind of then becomes. So this has been one of the. So then you're kind of facing a crisis situation. So there is a drought and it's going to be very bad, and you're like, for the face saving value, you're looking or some initiatives to be rolled out, of which some of these innovations are kind of taken from best practices that are demonstrated. That then kind of becomes one of the factors that kind of pushes this diffusion of. Sometimes there is this networking. There are IAS officers who kind of go on a sabbatical, intern, kind of build networks with organizations, pick up ideas. And then when they kind of back into their position, then there is some diffusion of some of these. So they bring in these network actors, they bring in these knowledge from where. So even that's where we believe in this networking a lot, like bringing forums which will bring these multiple actors together to be able to kind of leverage their strengths to be able to make a difference. So these would be the two. A crisis often kind of becomes an impetus for very much for face saving value, but sometimes they kind of lead to larger upscaling and mainstreaming, and the networking between these actors becomes very, very important.
In the Maharashtra case, there were two examples, which is the Ralegaon Siddhi to the Adarsh Gaon Yojana, which started off in the informal, non-formal to the formal. And the second is the Indo-German Watershed Development Program, which then later on evolved into the national guidelines.
There's two questions more. One is from Pallavi George, who's saying that, most of your examples are from the rural regions of India. Were there some that were also in the urban areas? That's one question. And then there is another one from a panelist who I will ask them to ask directly.
So I'll take this up. So for example, if we take Malin, it was a peri-urban area, basically, not completely rural, not completely urban. And we had the case studies of, let's say, the Tata groups, wherein we had also looked into their interventions in urban areas and the rural areas. However, when you see the disasters and when we were looking at the lens of, livelihood and socio-structural issues and the social injustice that were more towards the rural areas, like these are the areas which are completely dependent on the livelihoods that are nature based, so which is why they seem like they are mostly into or mostly focusing on rural areas. However, when they were upstream, they were for the entire region, entire state, entire country, which covers the urban, peri-urban as well as rural areas.
And things are still very important. We had a partner, we looked at 18 states, and we had another partner, IIH's Bangalore, who looked at 18 other states. And a lot of their case studies on OSDMA, the Orissa State Disaster Management Authority, their work on solar energy had kind of the peri-urban as well as the urban focus. And us, as Suchita said, yes, there is a touch to it, but then largely because we were looking for socio-structural transformative interventions, probably we could say we didn't find many in the urban context. So that's also
true.
yeah.
Okay. Professor Elizabeth, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, very quickly. I was struck, it's a great presentation. Thank you. I'm going to go out and get your book immediately. I was struck that the leaders that you had were all men, but it seemed like the associations, civil society associations were collections of women and minorities, for want of a better term. Do you see that as affecting disaster resilience in terms of changing social structures? So not just directly addressing the area of disaster, for example, but just changing social structures.
Definitely, there would be. We definitely believe that women do things better, and their solutions are a lot more contextual and relevant. It's not just in the non-governmental organizations or the collectives that you will see a predominance. Even when we looked at, we consciously tried to pick up leadership of, for example, when we were looking at Gujarat State Disaster Management Authority, we used the gender lens to kind of say, okay, who have been the different leaders? When women were there, what kind of interventions did they kind of bring about versus that of men? So men largely, especially in formal institutions, men would largely bring very technical apps and data dashboards and things like that, whereas women would kind of talk more about participatory, engaged kind of, even in formal bureaucratic leadership, we would kind of see that kind of gender differences. So and the book is online, fully available. So you could just search us, and you don't have to. It's available for everyone to. It's freely available. Yeah.
Thank you. There are 3 more questions I can see. I know we are out of time, but I don't know about the panelists. If you have a few minutes, we would be happy to ask those questions.
We would love to. We would love to take those questions.
Okay. Thank you. So there is a question from Vijay Kumar who is saying, how can we use technology to solve access to facilities during catastrophe? Are there any thoughts that you have on this?
As I said, the difference between men and women with regard to their approach to innovation, to initiatives. So many of the formal actors, there were a lot of apps, there were mapping, there were use of GIS, remote sensing kind of initiatives that were kind of. So it's definitely a part of it, but the only clause that we would kind of put is that it is not the only. Technology on its own, without contextual understanding, without understanding of socio-cultural relations that operate on ground, technologies also could be kind of equally insensitive to and not really inclusive of the most vulnerable that we are wanting to kind of address. So definitely we saw a lot of use of technology. Our school also kind of promotes a balance, but like how the formal and informal actors have to be there, similarly, the socio-cultural aspects as well as the technical aspects will have to go together.
Yeah, that makes sense. Dr. Deepak Kumar is asking the question that there are so many situations that are coming on disaster resilience, but when it comes to pollution and air crisis in Delhi NCR, Every year we have that as a question, and I don't know why that question. Yeah, what can be alternatives in disaster in making it work is the question that they're asking.
There are debates on can we look at air pollution as a disaster, but irrespective of the academic debates, yes, it is being kind of, now you will see Disaster Management Authority, the Delhi Disaster Management Authority, or the Bihar State Disaster Management Authority kind of coming up with SOPs, kind of coming up with initiatives. So it is very much within, and but as I said, the resilience initiatives in general are very few. It is largely information communication. So the kind of capacity building initiatives, the thinner version of resilience that you would kind of see. And our ask is for more underlying changes in root causes, which is primarily what we are looking at with regard to air pollution.
Thank you. And I think he's not here, and that is why not able to ask more. But there is Tanya Ahuja who's saying she has a methodological question where she's saying how were the categorizations verified or corroborated so as to avoid bias is one of them.
The vulnerabilities of the states.
Mhm.
So we all have kind of state action plans on climate change or the disaster management plans for the state. So first we did our analysis for socioeconomic vulnerability over the hazards, and then to corroborate it, we had these plans in place. So once that matched, and then only we went ahead with deciding whether the state is highly vulnerable or low vulnerable.
I see.
Yeah.
All right. I think Sonali, you have a question. So why don't you ask it directly?
Thank
And then
you.
also.
Sure. Very interestingly, one of the things that struck me was the chapter 9, where we discussed themes and the case studies. So one of the cases which belonged to, and the most intriguing of all of them was the network leadership part of it. And when I looked at the case by Chewang Norfel, we understood that he had mostly worked with strategic network. We read very little and very briefly about what operational network for him was. So I wanted to understand that in your opinion, is it possible that situations like disaster resilience would work without operational network?
So in my view, whenever it's a one-time kind of a thing, you could be able to work without an operational network where you create some kind of asset or infrastructure, and for the time being, the problem is solved. But we've also looked at sustainability. That is, how do you make sure that the capabilities are then transferred to the people so as to not depend on that individual on a long-term basis? And that then becomes a challenge, because when you don't have an operational network, you don't really have a movement going, and
Right.
you're not able to then develop innovative solutions going forward, because things will keep happening. Different things will keep happening. But in a one-time quick fix kind of a thing, this will work.
Okay, thank you.
Interesting. So thank you so much for your talk. And Sonali, maybe now you can also do the honors.
Thank you, ma'am. On behalf of the Ashang Desai Center for Leadership and Organizational Development at IIM Ahmedabad, I take the opportunity to thank all the authors of the book. I thank Professor Jaquleen, Ms. Suchita, and also Professor Zubin for being with us and having a very, very insightful 1 hour of discussion, and extremely timely, as we've been discussing for the past 1 hour, how timely the discussion has been. Thank you for letting us understand that the concept of resilience is much beyond the capacity to bounce back. It is much beyond that, which is lesser explored. Your book also gives us an opportunity to read about the Indian anecdotes, which is also essential to understand the studies and the timely evidences from the Indian ecosystem, which is rare in the research today. I move on to thanking our Zoom team for a seamless flow. It has always been a pleasure to work with you, and thank you for the entire session being carried on seamlessly. Last but not the least, to our attendees for joining us today out of their time. Without you, this wouldn't have been possible. Thank you for joining us, and I hope that all of you have taken away something valuable from us. For all the questions that have been answered, which was different and separate from the book and the PowerPoint presentation, which was extremely insightful for all of us to be given in practice. Thank you for being with us today. The Center at ADCLOD is, of course, dedicated to bringing up such kind of authors and discussions at the forefront together. And we hope that in the coming days, all of you join us again. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for having us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you. And I also like the fact that we've not just talked about a leader as a hero. We've talked about their actions, which I think is a really important aspect in that. So thank you so much. And we will continue to have these conversations. Thanks.